Puerto Rico, the island of Ricky Martin, Bad Bunny, Daddy Yankee, and piña coladas, is also known for its unusual political status. Because you see, VisualPolitik viewers, this island is not a state, but part an unincorporated territory of the United States of America. However, this could change very soon. Will Puerto Rico become the 51st state of the United States? In this video, we will tell you all the details. Its status is as unusual as it is controversial, because Puerto Rico, despite being under US sovereignty, does not participate in the vote for president, nor does it vote for senators or congressmen with voting rights. Despite this, Puerto Ricans have time and again ratified their desire to remain within this scheme. However, in recent years, something has been changing. The question arises, are Puerto Ricans ready to take the next step? Where is the island of enchantment headed? Well, in this video, we're going to tell you all the details. Let's get started. Puerto Rico has become the largest economy in the Caribbean, and the standard of living on this island is reasonably high. Obviously, being closely connected to the North American giant has certain benefits, and perhaps that is why both the government and the islanders themselves have practically never embarked on any independence venture. They have always been very attached to their Commonwealth regime. However, the last few years have not been easy, and the model seems increasingly out of date and is losing support. In the end, Puerto Ricans are US citizens, yes, but they have no real representation in Congress. They do not vote for federal authorities, and their justice system is not entirely autonomous. So in a way, Puerto Rico is still a colony. Perhaps that is why Puerto Ricans themselves have said, enough is enough. It is time to move forward. Not to move away from the United States, but rather to fully integrate with the North American giant. And the question is this really possible? And will we soon see Puerto Rico become the 51st state of the Union? What could such a change mean for the island? Today in this video, we're going to answer these questions, but before we do that, let's take a look at a little history to understand where it all began. Let's get into it.
From Madrid to Foraker and Jones.
During his second voyage to the American continent, Christopher Columbus came across the island we all know today as Puerto Rico. Its capital, San Juan, was so named precisely in honor of Prince John, then Prince of Asturias and heir to the throne of Castile and Aragon in what is now Spain. From that moment on, and for more than 400 years, the Spanish crown maintained control of the island, until eventually a confrontation between Spain and the United States changed this relationship forever in the 19th century. In 1895, the Cuban War broke out. In this conflict, pro-independence revolutionary rebels confronted the Spanish royalists. The pressure for the crown was increasing, and its position was more and more compromised. To try to alleviate the situation and the increasingly strong pro-independence sentiment, Madrid recognized both Cuba and Puerto Rico as autonomous regions in 1897. However, it was not enough, and what's more, Uncle Sam's help ended up backing the rebels. Finally, in 1898, a political military clash between Spain and the United States ended with a resounding defeat of the old empire. The peace agreement that was reached established that Cuba would remain under American guardianship, while Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines became direct colonial dependencies of the United States. For the first time, the United States demonstrated not only its strength, but above all, its status as a power and its ability to intervene abroad, to limit the influence of other foreign powers. However, despite this, it was not entirely clear what its relationship would be with these new territories that it now had under his control. Let's just say that in Washington, they didn't want to emulate the old colonial scheme of the Spanish or the British empires, which makes sense. After all, this country emerged as a reaction against the very concept of colony. Well, it was in 1900 when the then senator from Ohio, Joseph B. Foraker, led the drafting and approval of a law that bore his own surname, the Foraker Act, a law that established the new political scheme that would be applied from that moment on in Puerto Rico. For instance, this law determined that the President of the United States himself would appoint a governor for 4 years, who would govern alongside an executive council in which at least 5 of its 11 members would have to be Puerto Ricans. Simultaneously, a small local House of Delegates, consisting of 35 members, chosen by the local population, began to function on the island. For its part, the United States District Court for Puerto Rico was created to manage the island's judicial system, and an appeals process to the US Supreme Court was established. Also, despite not being a state, Puerto Ricans would be able to elect a resident commissioner, who would have a voice but no vote in the US House of Representatives. The states would be raised just 17 years later. In 1917, the Jones-Shafroth Act, signed by then President Woodrow Wilson, struck a blow with its Article 5. Just take a look at it.
All citizens of Puerto Rico and all natives of Puerto Rico who were temporarily absent from the island on the 11th of April 1899 and have thereafter returned to and are permanently residing in said island and are not citizens of any foreign country are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States and shall be considered and held as such. The Jones-Shafroth Act, 1917.
Suddenly, something very unusual for the time was done. Puerto Ricans were recognized as citizens of the United States, an unprecedented privilege. Puerto Ricans were not born in a formal US state, but nevertheless enjoyed the same rights. By the way, have you noticed what year this law was passed? Well, I say this because it is said that this initiative has a lot to do with increasing the recruiting base in the midst of World War I. Of course, we can't know for sure if that was the deciding factor. However, the Jones-Shafroth Act also created a locally elected and much more representative bicameral legislature, a chamber that became competent to legislate on island affairs. Of course, both the governor of the island and even, if necessary, the President of the United States had the right to veto. The point is that in only 17 years, Puerto Ricans became US citizens and set in motion the prototype of their civil government. But what exactly is this island? A colony? A territory subordinate to the United States? While it's true that Puerto Ricans are US citizens, the relationship of their land to the rest of the country is quite different. Listen up. By the way, before we continue, if you are someone who likes the world of economics, don't forget to look at our new sister channel, VisualPolitik. We'll leave you the link in the description and up here.
Commonwealth. Oh, no. Unincorporated territory.
The government of Puerto Rico continued to be elected from the Oval Office until 1947, when Act 447 of the US Congress established the possibility that the island's governor would finally be elected by the people themselves. Thus, Luis Muñoz Marin became the first governor elected by Puerto Ricans. His administration lasted no less than 16 years and was absolutely key to the island's status. For example, in 1950, Muñoz Marin managed to reach an agreement with Washington for the approval of Act 600, which gave Puerto Rico the possibility of having its own state constitution, as the rest of the states of the Union already had. It was a kind of fundamental law that established the organization of the territory. Well, in this text, which finally came into force in 1952, it establishes that Puerto Rico is itself a Commonwealth attached to the United States. But since the text is also written in Spanish, the translation speaks of a freely associated state, which is the status that the island still holds officially today. This marked a turning point. From that moment on, Muñoz Marin's own idea was that Puerto Rico should have more and more autonomy. As you're about to see, this is essentially the idea that modern Puerto Rico is founded on, and it defines its particular relationship with the United States. Take a look.
Siempre habrá un área de autoridad que delegaremos, que serán la defensa, la legislación inherente a la común ciudadanía, la legislación inherente a la moneda, a la común moneda, y algunas otras cosas por ese estilo. Pero el progreso es que cada día, según crezca el Estado Libre Asociado, los votos que ustedes y todos los puertorriqueños emitimos en las urnas tengan mayor y mayor autoridad sobre la vida de ustedes, sobre la vida de nosotros, de nuestros hijos, de todo el pueblo puertorriqueño.
However, not everything was so harmonious. In 1950, the Jayuya Uprising took place, a revolt led by armed pro-independence sectors that was quickly put down by the security forces. Let's just say that the whole free associated state thing was not really apparent. Be that as it may, in 1952, President Dwight Eisenhower gave the go-ahead, but demanded that a referendum be held to ascertain the true will of Puerto Ricans. The elections were held on 4th of November of that same year, and do you want to know the result? Well, no less than 87.8% of the islanders voted in favor of the new constitutional framework, establishing the Commonwealth. The support was, as you can see, overwhelming, an absolute majority. This would be one of the many referendums in which Puerto Ricans have expressed their support for maintaining ties with Washington. We could almost say that the second half of the 20th century was a kind of honeymoon period between the continental United States and Puerto Rico. Look at this.
Sanchez Valley, the arms dealer who changed history.
The second half of the 20th century was a bed of roses for the Puerto Rican economy. Around 1950, the US federal government introduced a package of tax incentives for US companies to settle on the island, generating a huge economic boom. Look at the difference with the rest of Latin America. Construction, hotels, businesses, new highways. Puerto Rico's economy began to flourish. And of course, this had significant social implications. Poverty was reduced, and practically all parameters improved. For years, Puerto Rico was considered a success story. And take note, because since the first referendum was held in 1952, Puerto Ricans have been called to the polls 6 times to express their opinion on the sovereignty status of the island. They did so in 1967, 1993, 1998, 2012, 2017, and 2020. Well, in all these public surveys, the link with Washington won, but in different ways. While the Commonwealth concept won until 2012, as of that year, the option in favour of becoming another state, a formal state of the United States, gained a clear majority. And the question is, what caused such a leap? Why did Puerto Ricans cease to be satisfied with their current status? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go way back to September 2008, when Luis Sanchez de Val was captured on the island for illegal arms trafficking. He was simultaneously indicted on that charge by both the US and Puerto Rican courts. The defendant then sued the state of the island by declaring that a person could not be charged twice for the same crime in the same jurisdiction, thus framing the renowned case, Puerto Rico v. Sanchez Val, which was resolved in 2015 with a controversial ruling.
Puerto Rico's authority to prosecute persons derives from the delegation by the United States Congress and not by virtue of any sovereignty of its own. The adoption of a constitution by delegation of Congress to organize local government in substitution for much of the organic law then in force did not represent a secession of sovereignty to Puerto Rico. To the contrary, Puerto Rico did not cease to be a territory of the United States. Puerto Rico Supreme Court Doctrine.
As you may be wondering, so what is so controversial about this? Basically, courts made it clear that the sovereignty of Puerto Rico does not rest with Puerto Ricans, but rather remains in the hands of Washington. Over the years, this concept, along with economic problems that we have already told you about in past videos, suddenly triggered the ambition to change Puerto Rico's status. In 2017, for example, the island was practically bankrupt with an external debt in excess of $70 billion. In fact, it was not until January 2022 that a federally appointed financial oversight committee managed to restructure the public debt with creditors. But of course, there is still a long way to go before the problem can be considered solved. But do you know what is most curious of all? The funny thing is that many of Puerto Rico's economic problems, if not the vast majority, have nothing to do with being a Commonwealth or the 51st state. We're talking about things like the Jones Merchant Marine Act passed in 1920 and still in effect today. This is a law that prohibits foreign flagged ships from transporting goods between 2 US ports. This makes moving things to and from Puerto Rico very expensive, which obviously erodes a lot of the island's competitiveness. Why is that? Well, because US flagged and crewed ships are much more expensive to operate. As an example, this law makes it impossible for large international freighters to unload goods destined for Puerto Rico on their way to or from the US. Instead, those goods have to make a much more convoluted journey to get to the island. Imagine Shanghai to Texas. Reload goods onto a US flagged ship, Texas to Puerto Rico. And then we also need to talk about things like the minimum wage and federal subsidy plans. But in order to understand this, look at this chart. As you can see, Puerto Rico is much poorer than the rest of the United States. However, since it has to apply the same federal minimum wage or an abnormally high level of social benefits in relation to what the parameters of the island actually are, and here the problem is evident. What is acceptable for Texas does not have to be the same for Puerto Rico. You could say that federal policies and regulations mean that when it comes down to it, very few people work in Puerto Rico. That is one of the main problems. Although, yes, it's true that things are improving thanks to new tax incentives for companies setting up on the island, well, when it comes down to it, the fact is that none of these problems would change if Puerto Rico ceases to be a Commonwealth and becomes just another US state. In fact, some of its tax benefits for businesses and investors could just disappear altogether. Yes, the island would gain more integration, influence, and probably government investment, but it would leave many other things by the wayside. Be that as it may, the option of becoming another state is the #1 favorite of Puerto Ricans. Take a look.
The status that went out of fashion.
In 2020, Puerto Rico held its latest referendum, but this time neither Commonwealth nor independence was an option. The question was much clearer. Should Puerto Rico be admitted immediately into the Union as a state? This is exactly the question that was asked in that referendum. Well, the yes vote obtained more than 50% of the votes, which gave the island's government the strength to lobby in Washington. It was a campaign in which the current governor, Pedro Pierluisi, is involved, but which requires overcoming a very complicated legislative circuit. For example, the House of Representatives must pass a law that enables a binding referendum for the federal government. That is, an election that not only allows citizens to express their opinion, as has been the case up until now, but also has legal and political consequences that allow the President of the United States to sign the incorporation of the new state. Well, in December 2022, with 233 votes in favor and 191 against, the lower house surprisingly succeeded in passing House Bill 8393. The first step was thus completed, but there is still the Senate, and that VisualPolitik community is not exactly a piece of cake. Why? Well, basically because Puerto Rico is a very democratic territory politically. In other words, many Republicans are afraid that what already happened with Hawaii will happen again, that Puerto Rico will be a democratic stronghold that will swing the majority in the chambers, particularly in the non-proportional Senate, where all states, regardless of their size or population, have 2 representatives.
We have to go senator by senator explaining to them why it is fair to give equal rights to American citizens residing in Puerto Rico. We also have to explain to them that Puerto Rico is diverse, that neither should Republican senators think that if Puerto Rico becomes a state automatically, that means there will be 2 senators and 4 Democratic congressmen. Pedro Pierluisi, governor of Puerto Rico.
So the whole thing seems complicated, but who knows? In any case, the Puerto Rican government has already set 5th of November 2023 as the date for a new referendum, hoping that by then, the Senate will have given the green light, and these elections can be the final step to becoming the 51st star on the American flag. Or at least the 51st state, because it seems that the flag will not be changed. We will see what impact there will be among Puerto Ricans if the legislature closes the door again. But for now, it's your turn. Do you think Puerto Rico should become a new state? What benefits would this option have? What do you think about the Commonwealth status? Leave us your comments here. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.